The battle raged across the shattered wastelands of Gorgon 7, a planet reduced to ruins by centuries of war. Fire and smoke painted the sky in hues of crimson and black, the air thick with the scent of scorched metal and death. Among the chaos, a lone figure moved with terrifying precision, a warrior unlike any the galaxy had seen before. Commander Zalera of the Draken Dominion was a force of nature. Towering over most humanoids, her sleek obsidian armor shimmered with the eerie glow of biotech plating, adapting to every move she made. Her twin plasma blades cut through enemy soldiers like paper, their dying screams drowned by the mechanical roar of war machines in the distance. Her reputation was legendary, unbeaten, merciless, a perfect weapon forged for destruction. The humans had resisted longer than expected. They were weak in body, fragile in comparison to the reptilian might of the Draken, yet they fought with a cunning that unsettled even the most experienced warlords. But it didn't matter. Humanity's final bastion on this world was crumbling, and Zalera was here to deliver the killing blow. She advanced through the wreckage, her visor scanning for remaining enemies. A small outpost lay ahead, barely defended, a desperate last stand. Her lips curled into a smirk. It would be over soon. A burst of laser fire whizzed past her, and she pivoted with unnatural speed, deflecting the shots effortlessly. A single human soldier stood at the entrance of the outpost, his uniform torn, his face smeared with dirt and blood. He was young, too young to be on this battlefield, yet here he was, standing his ground. Zalera almost ignored him. One soldier meant nothing. But then, he did something that caught her off guard. Instead of firing again, he threw down his weapon. She hesitated, her instincts screaming that this was a trick. No human had ever surrendered to her like this. They either fought to the bitter end or ran like cowards. This one, he just stood there, staring at her with defiant eyes. She stepped closer, towering over him. "You wish to die without a fight?" Her voice, filtered through her helmet, was cold, emotionless. The soldier shook his head. "I don't wish to die at all." His voice was steady, but there was something else, something she had never heard before on a battlefield. Not fear. Not desperation. Just, conviction. Zalera could have ended him in a second. A flick of her wrist, a swing of her blade, and he would be nothing more than another corpse in the ruins. And yet, she didn't move. Something about his answer, about the way he stood before her, made her pause. The battlefield had always been simple. Kill or be killed. Victory or defeat. But in that moment, staring into the eyes of an unarmed human, Zalera felt something she had never felt before. Doubt. Zalera stood motionless, her plasma blades humming with untamed energy, casting an eerie glow on the soldier's dirt-streaked face. The battlefield around them remained alive with chaos, distant explosions, the whine of fighter crafts slicing through the sky, and the dying groans of those too weak to keep fighting. And yet, in this small, ruined outpost, there was silence. A strange, uneasy silence. The human soldier didn't move. His hands were raised slightly, but not in submission, more like a gesture of caution, as if he was aware that the slightest wrong move would mean his death. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, and his sharp eyes never wavered from hers. He was unarmed, defenseless, and yet he stood there as if he had nothing to fear. Zalera's fingers twitched over the hilt of her blade. A warrior of her rank had no reason to hesitate. She had slaughtered entire battalions without a second thought. A single human meant nothing. And yet, her feet remained planted, her weapon unmoving. The human exhaled, shifting slightly. "Are you going to kill me?" His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, an edge of curiosity rather than fear. Most humans begged, cursed, or screamed when they faced death. This one simply waited. Zalera's grip tightened. "I should." "Then why don't you?" The question cut deeper than it should have. Her mind raced to find an answer, but none came. It was infuriating. This hesitation was foreign, unnatural. She had been trained since birth to be a weapon, to destroy without question, to see the weak as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. And yet, here she was, hesitating before an enemy who had already surrendered. Her eyes narrowed behind her helmet. "You expect mercy?" He shook his head. "No. I expect you to do what you were trained to do." The words struck her like a physical blow. They should have angered her. Instead, they unsettled her. This human, this insignificant soldier, spoke as if he understood something about her that even she didn't. She could kill him. She should kill him. And yet, for the first time in her long, blood-soaked career, she didn't want to. A crackling transmission interrupted the silence in her helmet. "Commander Zalera, report. The last human stronghold has fallen. All resistance is being eliminated." Zalera's jaw tightened. The war was ending. The Draken Dominion had won. There was no reason to spare this human. No reason to let him live. She took a step closer, looming over him. "What is your name?" The soldier hesitated for a moment before answering. "Ethan." A simple name. Short, unremarkable. And yet, somehow, it felt significant. Another pause. Then, before she could stop herself, she spoke words she never thought she would utter. "Come with me." Ethan blinked, confused. "What?" "You heard me," she said, her voice colder now, more controlled. "I'm taking you as a prisoner." That wasn't true. She had no orders to take prisoners. The Draken didn't keep captives. It was easier to exterminate all resistance. But she couldn't explain it, not even to herself, why she suddenly needed to keep this human alive. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "All right. No argument. No resistance." He simply accepted it, as if he had expected this outcome all along. Zalera turned sharply, motioning for him to follow. As she led him away from the ruins of the battlefield, her mind raced with questions she had no answers to. Something was happening, something she didn't understand. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure who she was fighting for anymore. Zalera marched through the battlefield, her steps precise and unwavering, but her mind was anything but steady. The human, Ethan, followed behind her in silence, his posture relaxed despite being surrounded by an army that had spent years exterminating his kind. He wasn't afraid. Or if he was, he concealed it well. Her soldiers barely acknowledged him as they passed, too focused on securing the remains of the last human stronghold. The war was over, and the Draken had won. It should have been a moment of triumph. And yet, Zalera felt nothing. She clenched her jaw as she approached her dropship, a sleek, black war vessel perched atop the battlefield like a predator surveying its kill. The doors hissed open, and she stepped inside, motioning for Ethan to follow. The moment he was inside, the doors sealed shut behind him, cutting off the sights and sounds of the dying world outside. Inside the ship, the air was cooler, sterile, filled with the low hum of energy cores and the faint blue glow of control panels lining the walls. Zalera removed her helmet, shaking out the strands of dark crimson hair that had been trapped beneath it. Her face was sharp, angular, her skin marked by faint bioluminescent lines that pulsed with a soft golden light. She turned to Ethan, expecting defiance or resistance, but he simply stared at her with an unreadable expression. "You should be dead," she said flatly, studying him. Ethan smirked. "And yet, here I am." His calm demeanor grated on her nerves. He had no reason to trust her, and yet he followed without protest. No fear. No begging for his life. He was behaving as if he belonged here, as if this situation wasn't strange at all. It was unnatural. "Do you think I saved you?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Did you?" Zalera stiffened. She didn't know. She had never taken prisoners before. The Draken didn't believe in mercy or captives. And yet, she had spared him, as if something deep inside her had rebelled against her own nature. She exhaled sharply, turning away. You are alive because I allowed it. That does not mean you are free. Fair enough, Ethan said, leaning casually against the wall. But I have to ask, why? She didn't answer. Because she didn't know. Before she could dwell on it further, the ship's intercom buzzed to life. Commander Zalera, High Warlord Vartan demands your immediate presence. The War Council is convening. She stiffened. The War Council. The leaders of the Dominion would expect a full report on the battle's conclusion. More importantly, they would want confirmation that every last human resistance fighter had been eradicated. She glanced at Ethan. He was the only loose end. Her fingers twitched toward her blade. One swift motion, and this problem would disappear. No questions. No doubt. And yet, she hesitated. Again. Ethan didn't move, as if daring her to make a decision. His gaze was steady, almost expectant. She exhaled sharply. Stay here. Do not leave this ship. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You trust me to stay put? Zalera's expression hardened. No. But I trust that you're smart enough to know what will happen if you don't. For the first time, Ethan laughed, an actual, genuine laugh. It wasn't mocking, nor was it bitter. It was amused, light, completely out of place in the tense atmosphere. Zalera frowned. What's so funny? Ethan shook his head. Nothing. It's just. I never thought I'd be having a conversation with a Draken warrior instead of dying at their hands. Something about the way he said it made her pause. There was no hatred in his voice. No venom. Just simple curiosity. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and exited the ship, sealing the door behind her. As she strode toward the War Council chamber, a nagging thought clung to the back of her mind. Why did she hesitate? And more importantly, why did she feel like Ethan already knew the answer? The War Council chamber was a towering construct of steel and fire, its walls pulsing with the eerie glow of Draken technology. It stood at the heart of the conquered city, a monument to the Dominion's absolute victory. Zalera walked through its vast halls with measured steps, her mind a battlefield of its own. Inside, the High Warlord and his generals stood around a massive holographic display, showing the planet's surface and the wreckage left in the Dominion's wake. The war was over. Humanity's last stronghold had fallen. There was nothing left to discuss, except ensuring the complete extermination of all survivors. High Warlord Vartan turned as she approached. His presence was imposing, even for a Draken. His bioarmor was heavier, his body lined with scars that marked decades of ruthless conquests. His golden eyes flickered with the satisfaction of victory. Commander Zalera, he rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. You have done well. The humans fought desperately, but their resistance was meaningless in the end. Zalera gave a sharp nod, forcing herself into the role she had played for years, the warrior, the executioner, the loyal soldier of the Dominion. Their defenses crumbled. No survivors remain in the primary sector. Vartan's eyes narrowed slightly. The primary sector. She knew what he was asking. Her report had been deliberately vague, avoiding mention of Ethan. If the council knew she had spared a human, had brought one onto her own ship, questions would follow. Questions she had no answers for. We are conducting final sweeps, she added, keeping her voice neutral. If there are any stragglers, they will not last long. Another general grunted in approval. They are fragile creatures. Weak. They survived this long only through deception and luck. Zalera remained silent. A part of her wanted to agree, to crush the doubt creeping into her thoughts. And yet, when she pictured Ethan standing unarmed before her, his eyes unwavering, his voice steady, she didn't see weakness. She saw something else entirely. Vartan studied her, his gaze sharp. And what of their final weapon? Zalera's expression remained unreadable. Destroyed. It was a lie. Ethan wasn't a weapon, not in the conventional sense. But something about him was dangerous. Not in the way a blade or a plasma rifle was dangerous, but in a way she couldn't define. The way he looked at her, the way he asked why she had spared him, it gnawed at her mind, refusing to be ignored. The High Warlord let out a satisfied growl. Good. The Dominion will move forward without opposition. We have already begun preparing for the next conquest. Zalera nodded, though she barely heard him. The war was over. But for the first time, she wasn't sure what that meant. As the meeting concluded, she made her way back toward her ship, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. This should have been simple. Kill the enemy. Secure victory. Move on. But it wasn't simple anymore. When the ship's doors hissed open, she found Ethan exactly where she had left him, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with the same infuriating calmness as before. Good meeting? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Zalera ignored the question and stepped inside, the doors sealing shut behind her. She needed answers. She turned to him, her voice sharp. Why didn't you fight? Ethan didn't seem surprised by the question. Would it have changed anything? She clenched her jaw. Most humans would rather die than surrender. He nodded slightly. Probably. But most humans also wouldn't be standing here, having a conversation with you. She hated how easily he threw her own logic back at her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she asked something she had never asked an enemy before. What do you believe in? Ethan's expression shifted, his usual smirk fading into something more serious. He was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words. Then, he spoke. I believe people aren't just the sum of their orders. Zalera felt something tighten in her chest. Ethan wasn't just talking about himself. He was talking about her. Her fists clenched. He was dangerous, not because he was human, not because he was a soldier. He was dangerous because he saw something in her that she wasn't ready to see in herself. She turned away, her voice colder than before. You assume too much. Ethan smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe you're just starting to realize I'm right. Zalera exhaled sharply and left the room, the door hissing shut behind her. But no matter how far she walked, she couldn't escape his words. Zalera sat alone in her quarters, the dim glow of the ship's control panel casting flickering shadows across the metallic walls. The war was over. The Dominion had won. There was nothing left to fight for. And yet, for the first time in her life, she felt unsettled. She ran a hand over her plasma blade, its edge humming faintly with restrained energy. This weapon had been an extension of her arm since childhood. She had trained with it, killed with it, won countless battles with it. It had never failed her. And yet, standing before that human on the battlefield, she had hesitated. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. I believe people aren't just the sum of their orders. Her grip tightened around the hilt. What did he know of war? Of duty? He was a human, a species so fragile and foolish they had all but ensured their own extinction. They had fought with desperation, with defiance, but in the end, they had fallen like all others before them. That was the way of the galaxy. The strong conquered, and the weak perished. That was the law she had been raised on. Then why couldn't she stop thinking about his eyes? A sharp chime interrupted her thoughts. The security system had activated. Someone had accessed the lower deck. Zalera's eyes narrowed as she rose, her steps swift and silent as she made her way through the corridors. The ship was on lockdown. The only one on board besides her was. She found Ethan in the ship's observation bay, standing before the massive viewport that stretched across the entire wall. The glass revealed a breathtaking sight, Gorgon 7, the war-torn planet, now a graveyard of fire and ruin. The sky was thick with smoke, the remains of human cities barely visible beneath the swirling clouds. He didn't turn as she approached. "I never thought I'd see my homeworld like this," he murmured. His voice wasn't angry. Just tired. Zalera studied him, unsure what to say. She had seen soldiers weep for fallen comrades, had watched warriors beg for their lives, but Ethan was different. He stood in the presence of his planet's destroyer, the commander of the army that had wiped out his people, and yet he didn't beg. He didn't curse. She stepped closer. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan finally turned, meeting her gaze. "Why did you bring me, Zalera?" She stiffened. He had never spoken her name before. It felt strange hearing it from a human's lips. "You are a prisoner." He tilted his head slightly. "Am I?" She didn't answer. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You don't know why, do you?" Zalera's hands clenched into fists. "You're a fool if you think I won't kill you." Ethan smiled faintly. "You could have killed me a dozen times already. You didn't." Her fingers twitched over her blade. A part of her wanted to strike, to end this uncertainty, to silence him before he could say anything else that chipped away at the foundation of everything she believed in. But she didn't. Ethan turned back toward the viewport. "You know, for years, humans told stories about your kind. The Draken were supposed to be unstoppable. Brutal. No weaknesses." Zalera's eyes narrowed. "And?" He glanced at her, a knowing look in his eyes. "And yet here I am. And here you are." She hated how easily he unraveled her. How his words forced her to confront the one truth she wasn't ready to face. She had spared him. Not because of orders. Not because of strategy. Because she wanted to. Zalera's jaw tightened. "You assume too much." Ethan smiled, that same maddeningly calm smile. "Maybe. Or maybe you're just starting to realize that not everything has to be about war." Zalera turned sharply and walked away, her heart pounding harder than it should have. But as the doors sealed behind her, she knew something had changed. And for the first time, she didn't know what came next. Zalera paced inside her private chamber, her mind a storm of unspoken thoughts. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to feel like this, uncertain, conflicted. She had been raised in the Draken warrior caste, trained from childhood to obey without question. Emotions were a weakness. Mercy was a flaw. And yet, ever since she had spared Ethan, she had done nothing but question. Why had she brought him onto her ship? Why had she lied to the War Council? And why, did his words keep echoing inside her mind like an unsolvable riddle? People aren't just the sum of their orders. She hated how those words gnawed at her. The Draken were their orders. That was their strength, their purpose. That was why they had conquered world after world, wiped out civilization after civilization. Obedience. Power. Strength. Then why did she hesitate? A sharp knock at her chamber door pulled her from her thoughts. She straightened, her expression hardening. "Enter." The door hissed open, revealing her second-in-command, Valkyr. His piercing golden eyes immediately locked onto her, and she knew something was wrong. "Commander," he said, stepping inside. "There are whispers among the crew." Zalera's muscles tensed. "Whispers?" "About the human," Valkyr said bluntly. "Soldiers saw you bring him aboard. Some are questioning why he still breathes." Zalera kept her expression unreadable. "He is a prisoner." Valkyr's eyes darkened. The Dominion does not take prisoners. A heavy silence settled between them. She knew what he was implying. A Draken warrior who defied protocol, who spared an enemy, was a threat. And threats were eliminated. You have been loyal to the Dominion your entire life, Valkyr continued, stepping closer. Do not let a single human taint that. Zalera forced her hands to remain steady. You doubt me? I question you, he corrected. There is a difference. Zalera met his gaze, knowing that if she showed even the slightest weakness, it would spread like a disease through the ranks. Warriors followed strength, and if they suspected hesitation in their commander, they would turn on her without hesitation. She exhaled slowly. The human is irrelevant. Valkyr studied her for a long moment before nodding. Then prove it. Zalera didn't respond as he turned and left. The moment the door sealed behind him, she let out a slow breath. Prove it. She knew what he meant. If she wanted to keep her command, to maintain control, she had only one choice. She had to kill Ethan. Her fingers twitched toward the hilt of her blade as she turned sharply and made her way toward the lower deck. The corridors of the warship felt suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in around her. When she reached the observation bay, she found Ethan exactly where she had last seen him, still gazing out at the ruined planet below. He didn't turn. You're here to kill me, aren't you? Zalera froze. His voice wasn't fearful. It wasn't bitter. It was, accepting. Her grip tightened around her blade. I should. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Then why haven't you? She took a step closer, her shadow stretching across the floor. Do you want to die? Ethan finally turned to face her. No. But I know what happens to people who don't fit into the Dominion's perfect system. Something in her chest tightened. He was right. The Dominion did not tolerate disobedience. The strong ruled, and the weak were erased. And right now, the weakest thing in the room wasn't Ethan. It was her hesitation. Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. If you really believed in the Dominion's way, I'd already be dead. Zalera's jaw clenched. You think I won't do it? Ethan took a step forward, closing the distance between them. I think you don't know if you'll do it. She hated how he could read her so easily. Her blade hummed in her grip, the deadly energy vibrating against her fingers. It would be so easy. One strike. One clean cut. And all this uncertainty, all this weakness, would be gone. But she couldn't do it. Ethan held her gaze, waiting. Not flinching. Not afraid. Zalera exhaled sharply, lowering her weapon. You are a fool. Ethan smiled slightly. Maybe. But so are you, if you think the Dominion won't turn on you for this. She already knew that. The moment she had spared him, her fate had been sealed. And for the first time, Zalera realized, she didn't care. The Dominion had trained her to be a perfect warrior, to obey without question, to kill without hesitation. But in this moment, standing before a man who should have been her enemy, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just a weapon. She wasn't just the sum of her orders. Zalera deactivated her blade. We need to leave this ship. Ethan blinked. What? She turned, her mind racing. I can't protect you here. If the crew suspects the truth, they'll kill you, and then they'll come for me. Ethan studied her carefully. You're really doing this? Zalera exhaled. Yes. A slow smile crossed his lips. Guess you're more human than you thought. She scowled. Don't push your luck. But as she led him toward the escape bay, she knew there was no turning back. For the first time in her life, Zalera was about to disobey. And for the first time in her life, she felt free. Zalera moved swiftly through the dimly lit corridors of her warship, her mind sharper than ever. Every step felt like stepping into uncharted territory. She had fought in countless battles, survived impossible odds, and carved her name into the legends of the Dominion. But this, betraying everything she had ever known, was something even she had never imagined. Ethan followed closely behind her, his breathing steady despite the danger they faced. He knew what this meant. If they were caught, there would be no trial, no mercy. The Dominion didn't tolerate traitors. They approached the hangar bay, where a row of small transport ships sat docked. Zalera moved to the control panel, her fingers dancing over the keys as she disabled the security protocols. The ship's artificial intelligence would take time to notice, but it wouldn't be long before alarms rang through the halls. Ethan stood beside her, watching carefully. "You're sure about this?" Zalera didn't answer immediately. Was she sure? No. But certainty was a luxury she no longer had. She glanced at him. "If I wasn't, you'd be dead already." Ethan smirked. "Fair point." The transport ship's door slid open with a hiss. Zalera stepped inside first, scanning the controls. She had flown these before, quick, agile, designed for planetary invasions and covert extractions. This one would do. Ethan followed her inside, shutting the hatch behind him. As Zalera activated the launch sequence, a warning flashed across the screen. Unauthorized launch detected. Security lockdown engaged. Zalera swore under her breath. The Dominion's warships were designed for absolute control. The moment an unauthorized ship tried to escape, the entire fleet would be alerted. Ethan leaned over her shoulder, reading the warning. "That's not good." "No, it's not," she muttered. Footsteps echoed in the hangar. Zalera turned sharply, her instincts honed from years of battle. Valkyr stood at the entrance, flanked by 4 heavily armed soldiers. His golden eyes burned with quiet fury. "I knew it," he said, voice thick with disgust. "You've betrayed your own kind." Zalera stepped forward, standing between Ethan and the soldiers. "Step aside, Valkyr." He let out a low growl. "You would abandon everything, for this?" His gaze flickered to Ethan, filled with contempt. "For a human?" Zalera's grip tightened around her plasma blade. "For myself." Valkyr's eyes darkened. "You are not yourself. This is weakness speaking." Zalera's stance remained firm. "If mercy is weakness, then I welcome it." Valkyr's fingers flexed over his weapon. "Then you leave me no choice." The soldiers raised their weapons. Zalera reacted instantly. Her plasma blade ignited in a brilliant arc of blue energy, slicing through the air as she lunged. Valkyr barely had time to parry as their weapons clashed, sending sparks across the hangar floor. The soldiers moved to flank her, but Ethan was already in motion. He grabbed one of the soldiers' rifles, wrenching it from their grip before slamming an elbow into their face. Another turned on him, but he dodged, rolling behind a stack of crates. Zalera fought with precision, her blade a blur as she deflected strikes from multiple directions. She had trained these soldiers. She knew their movements, their weaknesses. One by one, they fell. Valkyr was the last. He was a warrior, strong and relentless, but Zalera had something he did not, purpose. With a final strike, she disarmed him, sending his weapon clattering to the ground. She stood over him, her blade inches from his throat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Valkyr exhaled, his expression unreadable. "You were our greatest warrior." Zalera's gaze didn't waver. "I still am." She deactivated her blade. Valkyr stared at her in shock. "You're letting me live?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. Zalera turned away. "Kill me if you want, but I won't be like the Dominion anymore." Valkyr didn't move. He watched as she and Ethan boarded the transport ship. The hatch sealed, and within moments, the engines roared to life. Zalera gripped the controls, guiding the ship through the hangar doors and into open space. The Dominion's fleet was already mobilizing, but she had anticipated that. She pushed the engines to their limit, weaving between warships, dodging plasma fire as alarms blared across the comms. Ethan sat beside her, gripping the seat. "Tell me you have a plan." Zalera's fingers flew over the controls. "There's a jump gate near the outer ring of the system. If we reach it, we can disappear." Ethan exhaled sharply. "And if we don't?" She didn't answer. The ship rocked as enemy fire grazed their hull. Zalera's focus narrowed. The jump gate was in sight. One final push. The Dominion's warships closed in. Target locks engaged. Zalera took a breath, and made her choice. She angled the ship down, diving into the gravity well of the nearby planet. The enemy ships followed. At the last moment, she pulled up, using the planet's gravity to slingshot them forward. The Dominion's warships struggled to adjust. She punched the engines to maximum, speeding toward the jump gate. A warning blared, "Incoming fire." Ethan gritted his teeth. "This is gonna be close." Zalera didn't hesitate. She activated the jump drive. A burst of light engulfed the ship as they entered the gate. And then, silence. The Dominion's fleet was gone. The warships, the alarms, the battlefield, gone. Zalera let out a slow breath. They had escaped. Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his seat. "So, what now?" Zalera stared at the vast emptiness of space before them. For the first time in her life, she had no orders, no mission, no war to fight. She turned to Ethan, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. "Now," she said, "we decide for ourselves.